Ladies, gentlemen, and Vault Hunters of all ages, with the days dwindling down until the release of Borderlands 4, time is running short to work out which of the characters you want to play for your first playthrough. So far, we've had trailers released both for the lore backgrounds and the combat abilities of each Vault Hunter, but you may have missed things like their entire skill trees being completely released on the official Borderlands website. And on top of that, I was given the opportunity to play Borderlands 4 early by the folks over at Gearbox, and my character of choice for my first go was Amon the Forgeknight. I can't share too much of my personal footage or experiences. We're quite limited on what we're allowed to talk about early, but I can share a little bit and use that to add context to the officially released information as well. So today let's break down every bit of Amon that might help you out in possibly the most impactful choice that you can make for your first playthrough, which is which Vault Hunter you choose to play. Before we get into the gameplay side then, Amon's voice actor is Ray Chase, who was also the voice for Reese Strongfork in Borderlands 3 and New Tales from the Borderlands.
But before I give you this key fragment, I have one last thing to ask of you. Am I pulling off this mustache or what?
And if you don't believe me that that's the same guy, here's him going from one voice immediately into the other.
My name is Ray Chase, and I am proud to announce that I am voicing
Amon the Forgeknight.
It's a crazy transformation. I love the voice, and he's got a ton of high-quality voice acting credits too over the years, including the Piss Wizard from Yakuza Like a Dragon. So, put simply, if the actual line delivery and dialogue that your character adds to the playthrough is something that you care about, Amon is going to be an incredibly good choice. Not that any of them will be necessarily a bad choice, but Amon from that side of things is a personal favorite. As for his story, he was raised in a cult that worshipped vault monsters, which then led, honestly, sort of impressively, in them actually coming across and opening a vault, and all of them being slaughtered except for Amon himself, including his family. Essentially, his character short that was released is a reflection of this backstory. It is Amon all grown up, finding himself in the exact same situation, a different vault-worshipping cult actively opening a vault, and he manages to stop them and stop the vault monster, as his whole sort of objective in life is just to kill as many vault monsters as he can, which sort of brings a different meaning to the term Vault Hunter. But the passion that he brings to this is reflected similarly in his compassion for others and his love of storytelling and bringing warmth into the life of his companions. He's kind, he's loving, he's deep and introspective. He just has a little bit of a murderous rampage streak going on at the same time. It's no biggie. Moving on to the gameplay side of things then, there are a number of different elemental and status damage types in Borderlands, and every one of the 4 Vault Hunters has inbuilt synergies for at least 2 of them that makes them work better with that damage type through their skill tree choices. Amon's damage types early game are either fire or incendiary damage, which is the one that's extra strong against flesh or red health, and you also have a chance of applying the burn status with fire damage too, which deals incendiary damage per second for a few seconds. Then Amon's other main synergy is cryo damage, which is slightly strong against shields but not as strong as shock damage. It will slow their actual movements as well, and it also applies the freeze status, which makes enemies take bonus damage from crits and melee hits. And that of course leans into the fact that Amon has a very solid melee playstyle that he can use, and for those worried about the viability of melee, I played his melee skill and a mostly melee playstyle on hard mode in some of the footage that you'll have seen in the background of the video, and personally, I think it feels great. You'll have to build into it and lean into it of course, but from the section that I'm allowed to talk about of gameplay, I played it there, and it was very viable and fun. For most Vault Hunters, this is when we would talk about their passive trait, but Amon's passive trait is essentially a second action skill tied to each of the action skills that you can activate separately or at the same time. So we'll talk about it in the context of each skill, but know that this passive is called a forged skill, so whenever I say that term, this is where it comes from. First up for action skills, let's talk Onslaughter. This puts a fiery border on your screen when you activate it to show that it's going, and while active you gain movement speed, constant shield regeneration, and bonus gun damage as incendiary damage. As well, your melee gets changed to being a rocket punch, which dashes to enemies even from particularly long range, as long as they are in your crosshairs and there isn't like terrain in between you as well. It does incendiary melee damage in a cone in front of you where you end up hitting, and it causes a guaranteed stagger against small enemies, a chance for stagger against badasses, and no stagger on bosses of course, and worth mentioning that while the skill is active, you can do the rocket punch by just pressing the action skill button again instead of the melee button, so you don't have to worry about any awkward input overlaps. The forge skill for this one is Molten Slam. Hold the action button down to smack a giant molten forge hammer into the ground for a big pop of incendiary melee damage to all enemies around you. These abilities are on their own independent cooldowns, and you can use them separately, or you can use them together, it's up to you. As for how this skill changes through the skill tree, let's hit up the augments and capstones in the Calamity skill tree, which is the one that is attached to this skill. The two augments in the base tree, the sort of beginning section, you can get these after spending your first 5 points, are Pyroclast, which makes activating Onslaughter fully refill your health and shields, and then surround you with a Forge Storm for the duration. The Forge Storm deals incendiary status effect damage to any enemies in the radius, and it also gives you a kill skill that activates for any enemy that dies in the storm's radius, which gives you some of your action skill duration back and increases the damage of the storm itself as it progresses. The idea being that in a combat that has lots of enemies, you can just sort of smash through everything. The shield regen keeping you alive, the movement speed keeping you in the action, the kill skill making the duration last as long as the fight does as well, hopefully too. The other base tree augment is Thermal Diffusion. This gives you an alternate Rocket Punch mode, as well as making the Rocket Punch itself in either mode have increased radius and scale its damage based off of your maximum shield capacity. This makes the action skill Repress to act like the actual normal version of the Rocket Punch, and makes it so that the melee input version instead is now cryo melee damage instead of incendiary, so you can use ice punches until the enemy is frozen, which then makes them take more melee damage in general too, and that is a solid combo. But it doesn't get the duration extensions like the other augment does, which I do quite prefer. You can only have one augment active at a time, so you do have to choose one of these two for your initial journey with the skill. Then we get into the branches. Every skill tree has 3 branches that you can access after putting 15 skill points into it, and each branch has a unique augment, as well as unique capstone, and like augments, you can only have one capstone equipped at a time. The first branch has the Fellfrost augment, which makes it so you can press the action skill button immediately after a rocket punch to do a follow-up attack for cryo melee damage in a large cone, as well as immediately executing any non-bosses under 25% HP. The capstone for this branch is called Horcleave, and this replaces Molten Slam, the forge skill with a variant that uses a giant cryo forge axe to fire a wave forwards that deals cryo melee damage and auto-freezes enemies as well, and not to mention that it also makes any enemies killed by this trigger a detonation for cryo damage, and detonation is a specific term that will also pop up a fair amount in these other skill trees too for some potential synergies. The rest of this branch is heavily cryo damage based, but also heavily kill skill based, and then it also has a passive that gives you a chance to activate kill skills on melee damage done, which is pretty massive for stuff like fighting bosses. The second branch has a Force of Nature augment, and this makes gun damage prime enemies for detonation, then they detonate either on death or when damaged by your forge skill for a big pop of AoE incendiary damage, and you can also detonate with melee attacks, but this does less damage than the forge skill. The capstone of this branch is Molten Royal, which makes Molten Slam gain increased radius and also gives it a damage storing effect, which then adds erupting pyres under enemies based on the damage that you have stored. This branch is mostly based around incendiary damage in general, and this is much more based around guns than melee, as it has passives that can make his melee refill his ammo or pass to increased fire rate and spreading incendiary damage detonations with critical hits. Then the third branch for this tree has the Fulminating Fist augment, and this is the first spot you will see Amon start to go into a bit of shock synergy. This gives Amon increased status effect chance with Onslaughter active and gives you an alternate rocket punch option that instead fires a lightning wave forwards, piercing and dealing shock melee damage. The capstone in this branch is called Stormcutter, which again replaces the forge skill. This one swings a giant lightning sword in front of you, firing out a wave of shock damage, and any enemy that it hits either restores action skill cooldown if the skill is on cooldown, restores duration if it's currently active, or it also restores ordinance cooldown reduction too. The branch has a specific goal of mixed shock and incendiary damage synergy, especially leaning into the status side of things of those damage types, including a passive that makes any burn also apply shock and vice versa. This is also the branch that is trying to build frequently active action skills, as you can make any melee damage done restore forge skill cooldown, which when combined with the capstone itself making the forge skill return either action skill cooldown or duration is a very natural, long-lasting melee synergy. Next up on the list of action skills, let's talk Scourge. This one sticks out a big shield in front of you while active that absorbs all damage from the front until the meter on your screen is filled. Once the meter is filled, it only reduces the damage instead of fully absorbing, but you can spend some of the meter, called Vengeance, by pressing the action skill button while it's active to fire out waves of cryo ordnance damage called Forge Waves. Spending your Vengeance then also gives you the ability to absorb more damage through the shield, so it's a pretty cool combo. Onslaughter can build you tanky while being a melee-focused skill, but Scourge is the tank skill. The Forge skill for Scourge is called Firewall. It places a big incendiary wall on the ground in front of you, and this will block all projectiles from enemies, as well as increasing the damage of any friendly projectiles that go through it, and damaging any enemies that stand near it as well. The skill tree for this one is called Vengeance, and the augments on the base tree are Blast Chill, which makes Forge waves consume extra Vengeance to explode on impact, and further increases the radius if it passes through the Forge wall. Then for ultimate tankiness, there's Cryonic Thrum. While Scourge is active, you taunt all enemies, meaning they are less likely to attack other players, and you deal cryo ordnance damage to everything around you while also restoring some health for yourself and allies. With this active, you move slower when you're aiming down sights, but you also gain bonus cryo damage with your gun, and you consume Vengeance with every gunshot fired. So that means if you could have like a fast fire rate gun, you could keep emptying your Vengeance meter faster than you absorb damage, which means that you could keep the full damage absorption effect up instead of only the reduction. So it's a very cool augment for the earlier section of the game. Then we get into the branches for the skill tree. First branch has the Molten Rebuke augment, which replaces the Forge wave, which is the action skill press while already active, to consume all Vengeance and then throw the shield outward itself at enemies. It will then bounce off of enemies with the number of bounces depending on Vengeance consumed, but of course this means you also lose the shield effect while you're doing this, so it's very cool of a damaging effect at the cost of your tankiness. This branch generally has a high focus on incendiary damage and ricochets, including the actual shield bouncing that does count as a ricochet. The capstone is Ring of Frostfire, which turns the Forge skill into a Ring of Fire that deals incendiary damage to enemies inside of the ring, and cryo damage when enemies enter or leave, as well as giving friendly projectiles even stronger boosts when passing through. This branch has a cool trail of passives as well that all connect to each other that gives you Flame Affinity, which is a buff to reload speed and action skill cooldown rate, and then also lets you spend flame affinities for an extra cool ground slam called World Breaker. The second branch here has the Eternal Winter augment. This makes Forge waves partially restore action skill duration so you can elongate the effect, as well as Firewall duration when they hit enemies too, as well as letting you fire out loads of Forge waves back to back as a 3-hit combo. The third hit being an extra large Forge wave that does not cost any Vengeance to use either. The capstone is Glacial Rupture, which changes your Forge skill to instead make you slam 2 Forge whips to just sort of apply a pile of cryo ordnance damage and leave behind a cryonic fissure in the ground, and it just does a load of cryo damage around it. It launches a cryo hazard. It's just a full ice-based branch. Really, it has some fun combos around freezing enemies and cryo damage in general, and has a sort of matching buff to the fire tree, which is cryo affinity for just general gun damage increase. Then we have the third branch, which again transforms the skill into a shock skill. This replaces the Forge waves with Storm Lance, which throws a shock ordnance damage spear out in front of you, and enemies that are hit by this are primed for detonation. You can detonate this with the Forge skill damage for high single target damage, and these can also be popped by gun critical hits for less damage. The capstone in this branch is called Wrathfall, and it replaces the Forge skill with a giant Forge sword that slams down on an area for high shock ordnance damage that is a guaranteed critical hit. And there is a passive in this branch that makes any ordnance crits apply shock for a portion of their damage dealt, as well as a kill skill for Forge skill cooldown rate, and then also the shock affinity buff, which increases critical hit damage per stack as well. So all those things put together shows a very natural synergy for Forge skill focused comboing within this branch. Finally, then we have the third action skill, Crucible. This is the action skill that gives you a choice of throwing either an incendiary axe or a cryo axe. They do melee of their respective element type and prime enemies for detonation. The detonations happen if they die or if you hit the enemy with a Forge skill, which then pops the damage in an AoE around them. This action skill has charges, so unlike the other two action skills for Amon, it regenerates uses over time, similar to how grenades work in Borderlands 4. The Forge skill is called Double Edge. It throws out a double-sided axe that does cryo damage on the way out before it boomerangs back into you, dealing incendiary damage on the return path. The skill tree for this one is called Cybernetics, and the augments in the base tree are Axe and Stone, which increases movement speed after damaging an enemy with a Forge axe, and lets you detonate the primed enemies with a melee attack instead of only with the Forge skills, as well as making Flame Axe detonations restore action skill cooldown, and Cryo Axe detonations restore ordnance cooldown. The other base tree augment is Endless War. This makes any primed enemies take extra extra gun damage with more gun damage per stack of the primed effect, and after any detonations, a Forge Axe spawns to randomly seek out a new enemy as well. And because I haven't seen people talk about it much, I also want to mention the Tempered Pyre passive as the earliest source of Forge drones, which are straight up like drones in the shape of weapons that function as little minions running around and attacking enemies alongside Amon. And I don't think people are all that aware that Amon can have minions, so I did want to point that out. That said, getting to the first branch, the branching path, the augment here is Hour of the Hammer. This replaces the skill itself with hammers instead of axes that you throw, and makes you choose between either frost or shock axes. So basically, you replace the fire axe with a shock axe. The capstone is Snowmaul. This replaces the forge skill with a twinned forge hammer that you throw out, and it ricochets between enemies, including extra ricochets per detonation cost, which is awesome. The rest of the branch is heavily focused on ordnance damage specifically, extra uses or refunded uses of ordnance, detonation radius, and there's a trail of passives that gives you forge drones whenever you activate ordnance, as well as making the hammer forge drones deal ordnance damage themselves that can also cause bonus detonations all on their own. The second branch has the Blade Tempest augment, and this is the main shock-focused branch for this skill. Blade Tempest itself removes the cryo part of the skill and replaces it with a shock sword. It turns the axes into swords in general, and instead of throwing one of them at a time, you now consume all of your charges at once to throw out a barrage of forged swords, and it changes your detonations to being a single target exploding effect that deals extra damage to the primed target itself instead of spreading area of effect damage around the place, so it's way more single target focused. The capstone is Storm Surge, which replaces the forge skill to throw out a twinned forge blade, which does shock melee damage on impact, and creates a forge storm where it lands that does shock status effect damage within the radius. And like the previous branch, there is a trail of passives for forge drones, this time giving sword forge drones with increased movement and attack speed, and they can also get a chance to critically hit, which also restores your action skill cooldown when it happens, so this one is definitely a bit more drone focused of a branch. Then the third branch has the Searing Cold augment, which very simply makes frost axes apply guaranteed full freeze, and flame axes pass through enemies as a piercing effect that can prime multiple detonations. The capstone is Conflangerang, which adjusts the forge skill to do incendiary damage in both directions, gain increased radius, and leave a trail of fire on the ground under it as it travels as well. Not to mention, if you detonate a primed enemy, it will restore some of your forge skill cooldown too. Aside from that, this branch focuses heavily on statuses, the mixing of freeze and burn specifically, and then there's a fun node here that gives you a special forge drone when you do a forge skill damage that creates a singularity, pulling enemies into it and grouping them up together while active. And that pretty much does it then, everyone. A relatively deep dive into Amon, the character, and all of his sort of playstyles for the Forgeknight. Action skills, the options that they can turn into as you progress, and everything that you can really do with him. Generally speaking, I would label him as being an extra survivable beefcake with options for a heavily melee-focused playstyle, an extremely tanky playstyle, or a fun mixed minion and movement type playstyle depending on how you choose to build the third skill. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and hopefully it helps you work out if Amon is going to be the Vault Hunter for you come release of the game in just a few days. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time,
I'm the conductor of the poop train!
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.